So I do have, it's 12 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started with our history for lunch today. It's hard to believe that we're already in the month of July. But I guess the weather it will tell you that we are in the month of July. But we would like to welcome our guest today. We have Dr. Daniel from East Carolina University, who will be presenting on his book, Time, Typology, and Point Traditions in Northeastern North Carolina. Dr. Daniel is a professor and chair of anthropology at East Carolina University. And Dr. Daniel, we do have, I believe, two of your students, because you had Wanda Lassiter also as a student. And then we also have Noah here today. Anyone else a student of Dr. Daniel in the past? Okay, so you do have two students here today.
Yeah. Well, they get extra credit, all right. For
okay, so y'all get extra credit today. You probably wanted that back when you were taking the classes, right? No. But again, we would like to welcome everyone. We are recording Dr. Daniel lecture today. So if you miss it or if you have to leave early, it will be available for viewing probably sometime at the beginning of the week. If you are joining us through Zoom, I'm going to ask everyone to please mute. If you have a question for Dr. Daniel, we will monitor through the chat session, so you can just type your question in there and we'll take all questions at the end of the program. But we're going to go ahead, Dr. Daniel, and turn it over to you.
All right, good deal. Okay, well, thank everybody for being here, and I appreciate the invitation to talk today about my book that was published last year, dealing with time, typology, and point traditions in North Carolina archaeology. So let me give you a brief overview of where we're going today. I'm going to talk about my book. So why this book? I'll talk a little bit about why I think it was time for this kind of book to be written. And in particular, this book is a reconsideration, if you will, of the important work by Geoffrey Coe, Formative Cultures of the Carolina Piedmont, where he basically defined the artifact typology and chronology for North Carolina. And so I'm going to use that as kind of the baseline. I use that as the baseline for my book and sort of a reconsideration of some of that. And in particular, it's important to talk about the concept of type. You know, what is a type? It's a deceptively simple term that, but it is used in archaeology in a specific way. In particular, it deals with the issues of typology and chronology, right? And so I'm going to just be selective about some of the parts of the typology and chronology that that I've kind of revisited in the book. And then lastly, I want to touch on the issues and that deals with professional and avocational interactions. And so since many of you are I think are just sort of public or interested public rather than professionals, I wanted to talk about that today. And so in fact, the book was written kind of, I tried to walk a fine line here, writing a book that was of sort of that it was of interest to professionals, but written in sort of a way that was accessible to the public, since many of the public there's thankfully a wide interest, a large interest in archaeology, and I think it was important to kind of deal with that. So I'll touch on that too as today. So first, let me talk about the Coe's work. That's what I refer to as the Brown Bible, right? Formative Cultures of Carolina Piedmont, published in 1964, reprinted something like 7 times. I think 25,000 copies have been written, and that number attests to the fact that Coe's book was as popular with the public as it was with the profession, right? one of those rare books that kind of does reaches both audiences. And so what Code did at the time, of course, was establish this the important artifact typology and chronology for North Carolina that have implications beyond the state of North Carolina, really across the eastern woodlands. And what he did is briefly in the center of the slide here is sort of the typology. Very briefly, it starts out at the bottom where the oldest points are represented, and it goes in time up to the later periods. And so for Coe, the earliest representations was an eared, concave base eared point that he called Hardaway Dalton. Then transition to sort of corner notch, side notching, corner notching, and then stem points in the middle archaic, and finally late archaic, and then the triangular points of the late prehistoric period. What's significant about that, of course, is the base that tells time, right? If you've only got a broken point, you want to know, hopefully it's the base, because that'll tell you where you are in time, right? All points by definition have tips, right? They have pointy ends. It's the base that tells time. And so how did Coe know that? Well, he did that. He knew that by the result of excavating the sites on the lower left here of the slide, these schematic representations of profiles from archaeological sites along the Yadkin, and then also along the Gads, along the Roanoke site, the Roanoke River in the northeastern part of the state. And in these sites, he was fortunate enough to find these sites where we refer to as being stratified. And think of stratification, something like a layer cake, where the lower layers on the bottom, and you have the upper layers as you go higher. The importance there is that deeper represents time based upon the geological principle of superposition. If you're the deeper you dig, the older you get, assuming you're digging in undisturbed sites. And that's what Coe found here. These three sites along the Yadkin River is the Hardaway site, Dorshik and Louder's Ferry, and then the Gadsden site, as I said, along the Roanoke. And what what he found here was in relatively undisturbed layers. He could identify these layers were primarily associated with one projectile point type, the types that you see in the middle of the screen. And these were various names he gave. Some of these type names he borrowed from elsewhere, the Savannah River, of course, the Hardaway Dalton, the Dalton point from the Missouri and Arkansas region. He had affinities with those points. And other point types he labeled based upon features and landscapes along the Yadkin River. The Palmer Point, for example, from Palmer Mountain there along the Yadkin River. The same way for the Morrow Mountain Point. And as you can see in this sequence, what the important thing was, he built a composite sequence. No sequence was entirely represented at one site. And so by putting these sequences together, right, finding similar point types at other sites, he essentially could define almost the entire prehistory of the state by putting these different sequences together. Of significance here is you'll see this Guilford point with this horizontal line. The Guilford point is represented at all these sites. It is the basal, the earliest point type at the Gaston site and the Louder's Ferry site, but it's only in the middle of the range at Dorshik and ultimately at Hardaway. So this then is typology and chronology. Remember, this is 1960s. In fact, some of these excavations were done in the late 50s and in the early 60s. And this is prior to radiocarbon dating. So the significance here is that how do you tell time when you can't absolutely date sites as we do today, is that we need to excavate these sites and understand them sort of stratigraphically. Coe, of course, placed some absolute dates on these sites. Archaeologists had a general sense of time, and he was in the ballpark, if not a little conservative in some of his estimates. But it was only shortly thereafter that radiocarbon dating came into vogue. There was only 4 radiocarbon dates that was listed in formative cultures. I think all those were Savannah River dates, right? And so today we have a whole range of dates that I'll talk about, some of which I'll talk about later, that we can help sort of refine this sequence. And finally, on the right, I'll just draw your attention. You probably can't read this. This is a table out of my book. The point of this table is that Coe made typological comparisons to point types all over the eastern woodlands. And Coe, he confirmed the types as much as he created them. And I don't say this to diminish the significance of Coe's work. Rather, I think it just enhances this. And so point types, for example, he knew the Dalton. He labeled Hardaway Dalton. The Dalton point was known from Missouri and Arkansas, as I said. So he could provide this horizon-like assumption that allowed archaeologists all over the eastern woodlands to begin to talk amongst each other in ways that made comparisons in time comparable. So why this book? So why my book, right? In terms of the subtitle of my book is Formative Cultures Revisited. So I think that after a half a century, we made some advances in archaeology that allow for some important updates and revisions to this original sequence. And I do this in several ways in my book. There's some, I address some ambiguity, and I think that existed with respect to some of the type definitions. For example, the difference between Palmer and corner notch points. They're both corner notch points, but there's some, I think, ambiguity there. I talk about Mara Mountain points, the Mara Mountain 1 versus Mara Mountain 2, make some distinctions there. And then I also include some point types that were not originally part of Coe's sequence. The Clovis fluted points were not part of Coe's sequence. Certainly we have Clovis points in North Carolina. I include those. There's some other points that I'll talk about in a minute that I think are an important part of the sequence that Coe did not find or initially recognized. And then some new dates. I mentioned dates. We have now over 300 radiocarbon and other chronometric dates in North Carolina, as well as several hundred more around the Southeast that allow us to, I think, update the chronology in a way that Coe was not essentially accessible to Coe. And these have implications for chronology. And then, as I said, this book, I tried to straddle that line, writing for the public, the professional, as well as the public, right? So first, let me talk a little bit about a type. Type is a deceptively simple term. For archaeologists, type is the basic unit of archaeological classification. It's one of those terms in archaeology that's intuitively understood by the public because we use that in our common everyday. We talk about types of food, types of clothes, types of music. But for archaeologists, types are particularly important. The term type is particularly important because type is used to define, particularly in this instance, is time and space. That's the basic thing we do as archaeologists is to take the archaeological assemblages, artifacts, sites, features, whatever that data is, and we organize that in time and space. And so the important thing to remember is that there's no one single best typology. The typology that you create depends upon the questions you ask. And for archaeologists, the basic question is sort of time and space. We can also classify artifacts functionally, right? What were they used for? And so the artifacts, the projectile points that I'm talking about here, they all were functionally used as projectiles, whether they were hafted on the end of a spear for a spear or a dart point, or as a projectile part of an arrow, right? They were functionally projectile points, but they also can be classified in terms of their place in time and space. So typology is important in that respect. So, and finally, I talk about, I use type here in the sense of point making traditions. And I think here is point making as a shared practice, that this was a skill that was taught and passed on as an important part of the culture. I mean, points were made to be used, and these were out of the many options that individuals had for point making, right? They chose particular ways to have to point, whether it was a stemmed, a corner notch, side notch, a fluted, whatever the case may be. But in that particular style of point making, I think tells us something too about a shared other implications for other shared traditions. So I'm using the term community of practice here as a something to think about, sort of ethnic groups, right? That in a way that we can hopefully tell us something about a large shared point traditions that tell us something about different other shared communities and their traditions across the landscape. All right, so I'm going to talk now briefly about some of the highlights, some of what I think are some of the refinements to the tradition that we can talk about today. And so the first is really deals with the earliest point traditions in North Carolina. And those are the fluted points. Interestingly, Coe did not include Clovis in his point typology. For Coe, the Hardaway complex was actually 3 point types: the Hardaway blade, the Hardaway Dalton, and the Hardaway side notch point. He did talk about Clovis, though. He did talk about fluted points in formative cultures. He made this passing statement in one of the last chapters of the book, of his book, where he said that 3 reasonably morphologically similar points to Clovis have been found at the Hardaway site. They were all found on the surface, not in context. And then he kind of left it at that. So the implication is that Coe thought that the Hardaway point, the Hardaway blade, was kind of the earliest point tradition in North Carolina. But I think today that we have we have now recognized Clovis as being sort of the earliest point type, consistent with Clovis points elsewhere in the Southeast, dating, over 13,000 years ago.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Daniel, but can you put, okay, thank you.
Okay, did I go on mute for some reason?
I accidentally put you on mute because I'm going to ask all of our guests today if you will please mute so we do not interrupt Dr. Daniel's talk today. Thank you.
Okay, so for me, the Clovis is sort of the earliest point traditions. I've been recording Clovis points, several hundred Clovis points across North Carolina. And so I think the Hardaway Dalton is probably the very latest, the latter point of the fluted point tradition, if you will. Some Hardaway points are fluted, and what do I mean by fluted? Um, it's this channel-like flake that is removed from the base of a point that goes sort of along the long axis of these points. And in some points, they're more pronounced than others. It's relatively minor in some of the Hardaway points. It's present in Clovis. It really fluting, I guess, fluoresces with what I call these redstone points in the Middle Paleo-Indian tradition. Now, there's some debate about the significance of fluting. Some thinks it's if it thins the base, maybe facilitates hafting. Some say it's simply it's a stylistic phenomenon that represents sort of the skill of the flute of the point maker. Whatever the case may be, fluting is sort of a diagnostic of the earliest point types in North Carolina. Whoops. So another point type that was not recognized by code that I think is an important part of the sequence is what's called the Southern Harden. The Harden point is a point type that's better known from the Midwest, Ohio, Illinois area. And I think in the North Carolina sequence, it fits between the Kirk corner notch point and the Kirk stem point. And that's the circled points here, the Kirk corner notch and the Kirk stem points. The early archaic, the latter part of the early archaic, the Kirk stem points, I think, represent the beginning of the middle archaic. And for Coe saw a continuity. Kirk corner notch is a predecessor for the Kirk stem, and hence the term Kirk. And I think he's right. I think a Kirk stem is sort of the technological descendant, if you will, of the Kirk corner notch. But it's a pretty big technological leap to go from this corner notching to a stemming in this manner. And I think this Harden point actually represents a nice transitional segue, if you will, between the 2 points. And so what distinguishes the Southern Harden point, it is a corner notch point, but the corner notching is different than the U-shaped notch of a Kirk point. It has more of a moon-shaped corner notch, and the stem itself is proportionately longer than the Kirk corner notch point. I think this longer stem presages the relatively long stem of the that you see on the Kirk stem, and then the stem itself has these beveling along both edges that you don't generally see on the Kirk corner notch point. Interestingly, these Harden points are really rare in North Carolina, and you have to really find these in private collections to get a sense of these. There's far fewer Harden points than there are fluted points in North Carolina, if the data that we've collected so far is accurate. So what does that mean? Well, I don't know that you can say points equal people, but at some level, I think the scarcity of the Harden point represents something about maybe a population decline that's going on at the end of the Kirk tradition, and it represents perhaps some intrusion or diffusion from the Midwest into North Carolina. And so some of my colleagues around the Southeast, Andy White, among others, talk about population declines in the lower South Atlantic slope, beginning sometime out in the sometime around 9,000 years ago. I won't go into detail here on that, but if that's true, these Harden points may reflect that level of population decline taking place in North Carolina. So that's interesting to think about sort of archaeologically. And then you get subsequent to that, you get these Kirk stem points known for their serrated recurvate blades. large stem, which essentially represents a removal, a corner removal rather than a corner notching that establishes the stem on these points. Subsequent to the Kirk stem, you get Middle Archaic. The hallmark of the Middle Archaic are stem points. There's a whole litany of stem points throughout the Middle Archaic. And Coe talked about the Kirk point, Stanley stemmed, and Savannah River stemmed. He talked about this stem continuity that takes place at that time. And while we see this continuity from about 8600 BP to around 4000 BP, it is also it is somewhat interrupted, if you will, by two other point types that Coe noted: the Morrow Mountain stem and the Guilford stem. Now, for Coe, he saw this technological or cultural continuity, and hence this vertical line between the Stanley and the Savannah River, that he saw this cultural continuity, yet temporally in between the Stanley and the Savannah River point, he noted the Morrow Mountain and Guilford points. And so he interpreted this to represent what he called these cultural intrusions. And he talked about from a Midwest or a Western intrusion of folks into the Carolinas, particularly the Piedmont, that is represented by these point manufacturers. While that may be the case, I'm thinking too that perhaps rather than an intrusion, that there may be more continuity here than what Coe recognized. And I base this upon some work at Louder's Ferry. Carmen Dry, a graduate student at UNC, did some reanalysis on the Louder's Ferry site along the Yadkin River, where she talked about Morrow Mountains and Guilford points, where she saw more, again, continuity or transition than she did distinct types. This, I think, sort of addresses some of the problems that certain archaeologists we've had in some instances for years. There'll be sometimes we'll find Morrow Mountain points where that barely have shoulders on them, right? So these, which might be categorized as a Morrow Mountain point based upon the slight shoulders, but they're but on the other hand, there could be these points that are so Morrow Mountain points whose shoulders are so heavily resharpened they resemble Guilford points. And so I think this essentially reflects the problem that some archaeologists have in sometimes distinguishing between Guilford and Morrow Mountain points. And so I think this reflects a certain level of continuity that ties these points together. And so what I did is I talked about, I divided Guilford points into a Guilford Lancelet 1 and a Guilford Lancelet 2, based upon bases where you get a more tapered base similar to the Morrow Mountain that reflects a Guilford Lancelet 1, and then a more concave base, and in some instances these Guilford points that have bases that more resemble the subsequent Savannah River points. And so the top right point here in the point on the slide in the far right, these I think could represent sort of transitions to Savannah River points. So these are some of the ideas that I'm kind of throwing out that I think can be tested here, that by further data from good datable context. So the last point I want to talk about too is a point that this MAC point, and This, I want to think too about some points, maybe less utilitarian and more ritualistic, and that's what I'm talk about with this MAC point, where some colleagues of mine in South Carolina have found these large, in some instances, they look like they're a very large Mara Mountain point. I call them a Mara Mountain point on steroids. In fact, I think some points have been misidentified. MAC points have been misidentified as Savannah River points. And some of my colleagues in South Carolina have found these points made of this flow-banded rhyolite that is very distinctive. Rhyolite is a type of stone that is geologically occurs in the Uwharrie Mountains. And some of my colleagues of mine are finding points like this down in South Carolina in early woodland contexts. They're finding caches of these points. And so this may reflect, I like to think of this as maybe reflecting some kind of exchange network here, and that finding them in these caches, they may have some sort of ritual or sacred function, in the sense that these points are rather large. They don't appear to have been used to any extent. And so I'm going to draw on some ethnographic analogy here. And so look at these large points that, these obsidian points that are used by these is ethnographically described by the Hoopa tribe in California from circa 1900, were these large obsidian bifaces. You can see this individual holding one here. And in the photographs in the right here, they're part of a ceremony, the white deerskin ceremony. This is a 2 or 3 day celebration where groups came together and did feasting, held these certain rituals where elders in the tribe would lead these dances. They would be dressed in these special regalia, the headdresses and these shell beaded necklaces, as you see here. And in their hands here, I don't know if you can see it in the right slide, but they have these large bifaces they're holding. These were, these obsidian bifaces would only come out for these certain ceremonies. After they were done, they would be wrapped up in bark and then buried in the floors of certain huts, and only could be brought out at these ceremonies. And so perhaps, again, I'm speculating, these large MAC points, these bifaces made of this exotic stone from North Carolina, could represent not utilitarian points that we've been talking about, but something that would have been used in a more ritualistic fashion. Just something to speculate and think about. All right, so those were some of just a brief overview of some of the changes and some of the speculations that I wrote about in my book. But in the last part of my book deals with sort of the issue of professional and avocational interactions. And since artifact collecting is a long time hobby in North Carolina, indeed all over the country, I wanted to talk about this in a way that tries to bring groups together, the professional and the amateurs, in a way that where there has been perhaps some tension in the past. There's and this is goes back decades, right? This goes back decades, and this is I'll just as one example of this from a newsletter, the Archaeological Society of North Carolina in 1938, where the sentence here, there's a tendency for the professional to be too critical of amateurs and to overlook and underestimate the value of their collections and their studies, right? And so I want to work from the premise that some collections do have scientific value, and if some collections that, if they're collected in the right way, can make contributions to the profession of archaeology. And so a lot of this tension has been brought about by the increased professionalization of archaeology. Archaeology is a profession, right? In the same way that other professions exist. Yet it's one of those unusual professions in that individuals can claim to be an amateur archaeologist or an avocational archaeologist in a way that other professions cannot be made to be a hot. So, for example, if I said I was an amateur brain surgeon, right, you might look at me as, well, you know, that's kind of crazy. I'm an amateur lawyer. Well, no, you can't be an amateur lawyer. There's no such thing as amateur lawyers. Yet, one could claim amateur status for an archaeology, as an archaeologist, and there's no issue with that. So, part of the tension I would submit is come about by the increased professionalization, and so what I would like to do is try to lower that friction, right, and try to help create a space where professionals and amateurs can work together, right, to promote the stewardship of the archaeological record. Stewardship here is key here, right? And this slide here is the 9 basic principles of archaeological ethics. You can go to the Society of American Archaeology webpage here. I'm not going to go over all of these principles here. I'm just going to focus here on stewardship as the core principle. And so stewardship here is, I think, the principle that, again, if you want to try to separate professional from an amateur status, stewardship is the key principle here. And what do I mean by that is that stewardship is the core principle because archaeologists work to promote the care. What's a steward? It's a caretaker of the archaeological record, right? And so archaeologists keep in mind that if they're digging an archaeological site, whatever data they're recovering, they're doing that with an eye towards they don't get a second chance to recover the data here. So they're doing it in a responsible way that's meticulously excavated and recorded and reported, right? If you dig it up, you got to write it up. Otherwise, you're not being a proper steward of the archaeological record. And so you've got to be accountable. You don't buy and sell artifacts. Commercialization is a problem that at some level does promote destruction of the archaeological record. And so as a professional archaeologist, we want to minimize the destruction of the archaeological record and promote its stewardship. And so and so in my book, I talk about the challenges I've dealt with in terms of working with avocational archaeologists. And so basically the challenges is I've worked with archaeologists in terms of recording fluted points, right? Here's the rub, right? If you're interested in understanding the Paleo-Indian time period, right? And which is represented by fluted points, the best way to get a good handle on Clovis points in North Carolina is going to private collections. You're not going to find 200-300 Clovis points in institutional collections. They just don't exist, right? And so for an individual like me, I've got to reach out to the avocational community to get that data, right? And in order to get that data, I've got to use that data in a good way. And so I work with responsible and responsive collectors. If they record where they've collected a point, where they know that's provenience, even if it's on a county level, that is helpful, right? And so those are the issues I work with. There's also the issue of fakes. and this is brought on by the increased commercialization of the buying and selling. Artifacts can go for exorbitant prices. You know, the antiques you see on Antique Roadshow, well, you want real antiques, you know, you deal with sort of archaeology. And so, unfortunately, there is buying and selling of artifacts, and some of these are fakes. There are unscrupulous people out there who replicate artifacts like this Clovis point on the right that was from a Raleigh flea market. There's a long story behind that where an individual contacted me, asked my opinion about that, and I thought he was probably fake, and eventually that was verified. And so so I have to be careful about, if I'm recording an artifact, I have to be careful if it's authentic or not. And so there's issues dealing with that. And then, you know, and then sort of the commercialization, which can lead to further destruction of the archaeological record. And so when I try to get collectors to move from ownership to stewardship, that's what separates professionals and avocationals, right? If from a mentality, a collecting mentality, to a stewardship mentality, from conservation rather than collecting. And so if I can work with collectors in a way that can help promote the archaeological record, and ultimately collectors should work to, and I would encourage them, if they have good collections that are well provenient, ultimately to donate their collections to an institution, right? Why should they do that? They say, well, I've spent all this time collecting artifacts. Why should I donate it? Well, my response is, why not donate it? If you want to be a steward, if you want to leave a legacy, then you've got to curate it, right? I've heard the story of too many private collections that after the owner dies, the family doesn't necessarily care for it. It's bought and sold, it's divided up, or worse, it's thrown away. And so that collector spent a lifetime collecting these artifacts only to see them disperse to the winds, right? If you want to be a steward, right? If you're really interested in preserving the past, right? Then ultimately they should be donated in a place that can be cared for forever. And so the SAA, this slide is the recently there's been a task force. Just a few years ago, a task force is now beginning to recognize the need to work with collectors in a way they haven't done so in the past. And these are some guidelines here for professionals to work with the avocational community, right? They're recognizing that some private collections have scientific value, right? And then we need to encourage responsible and responsive stewards. We need to encourage those collectors. If they're going to collect, then you ain't going to stop collecting, right? I'm telling you right now. If people are going to collect, they need to do that responsibly, and they need to record these, work with our archaeologists to identify where these sites are. We're not going to, there's no archaeology police. We're not going to swoop in and steal your sites. It's just not going to happen, right? The OSA has a simple one-page citizen science site form. You can fill out the information. You can record your sites there. It's the responsible thing to do. And ultimately, be a part of an organization that you can share that information with, and work with the professional communities to help create that legacy of that promotes the past, right? Without the public's support, right? Archaeology, you know, in the scheme of things, right? Archaeology, it's not going to save the world, right? But who want, But who wants to live in a world without archaeology, right? Who wants to live in a world without music, without fine literature, right? Without our knowledge of the past and appreciation of our antiquity, right? And so we need to have the public support behind us as professionals in order to do that, right? And so, well, anyway, so that's my little, I'll get off my soapbox now. I get wound up sometimes when I'm talking about this, so forgive me. But I talk about this in my book, and so I will shamelessly end my talk. I don't have a sunset, but I got a book flyer here that I will end my talk with. It's University of Alabama Press. You can order it online. It's available. You can go to Amazon and find bookstores everywhere. But if you go to University of Alabama Press, you can get a 30% discount code, right? Here it is, TTPT, that's time. It's time, typology, point, tradition, and 30, right? Enter that code and you'll save yourself some money. And with that, I'll stop and maybe we got time for a few questions.
Okay.
And I'll leave that over to Lori.
Okay. Yes, we do have a few questions. We have one in person. If you
Did the hunters that use the points make their own points, or was there a designated point maker in the tribe?
let's try. Hold on. He might
Did the hunters that made their, did hunters make their own points, or was there a designated point maker in the tribe that they acquired their points from?
Okay, good question. So probably the short answer is that that there was craft specialization was probably not the case early on for the vast majority of the Paleo-Indian or Archaic period. We don't, and we make that that statement based upon sort of historical and ethnographic information about hunters and gatherers, and so these are people living in small families, groups, right, and where they hunted and gathered, and essentially were hunting and gathering on their own as family groups. And so to do that, everybody needed to be able to to get the resources they needed from the landscape that included stone, right? And they would then make the stone tools themselves within their own family. And so craft specialization comes in much later in the archaeological record. We see that maybe in the Mississippian period with other items, but so it's probably just everybody, or at least one member of the family or a couple of members of the family learned to make stone tools.
We have another question in person. Hold for just a second.
Yes, hi, my name is Teresa, and I years ago took a class, one class with Professor Bottoms. I don't know if you know who that is, from UVA, I believe. And we looked at all these arrowheads and everything, and I just wondered, with the different types of arrowheads, is it possible that what they were hunting, because we know that they were also warning people if they were using it for that, or if they were using it for particular animals, maybe the age of the people that were making it, if that would make a difference in the type that they used. And then the second part of my question is the accuracy of carbon dating. Is that still in question, or has that been improved?
Okay, wow, two different questions. Sure, the projectile points were used primarily for hunting. The evidence of warfare, the earliest evidence of warfare, at least projectile points as a as a weapon. We don't see that until the advent of the bow and arrow, and we find in some cases small triangular points lodged in human remains, right? Human skeletons, right? And so that's not to say that nobody used a palmar point to stab somebody else in the early archaic, but we just don't see any evidence of that. And so the trauma we see with respect to using points doesn't really appear until the woodland period. In fact, some scholars sort of talk about the advent of the bow and arrow being originating as much for warfare purposes as it is for hunting purposes, right? Then the second question, radiocarbon dating, the accuracy. Radiocarbon dating is fairly accurate's kind of a loaded term. I think it is a very good dating technique. Its limitations are number one, it can only be used on organic remains, right? Primarily in archaeology, it's charcoal, shell, bone, right? And then it has a upper limit of about 50,000 years or so. After that, it's essentially any material is carbon dead. And of course, with carbon dates, you get there's a fudge factor, as with any kind of dating method. When you submit, say you submit some charcoal for a date, and you'll get a date, and it's a plus or minus factor. It's like a standard deviation statistically, and what that means is that you'll get a date, and you'll say 5,000 years plus or minus, 100 years, right? And so what that means is that there's a 66% chance that date's kind of in the mid-range. If here I'm getting a little statistical, but if you want to increase that accuracy to 99%, then you double the standard deviation to 200 years. But the important thing now, the good news now, is that radiocarbon dating, the precision of radiocarbon dating is really is becoming quite refined. And so in some cases, you can get carbon dates that have a plus or minus factor of just a couple decades, right? 10, 20, 30 years, right? That's incredibly precise for radiocarbon dating. And that depends, again, against the quality of the carbon and sort of the lack of contamination and the refinement of our ability to do that. So carbon dating is the workhorse of archaeology. It is particularly here in North America, where we've got, most of the sites are much less than 50,000 years old. And in most sites, you've got some level of charcoal. There's other dating methods, OSL, where you can actually date sand, and then dendrochronology, tree ring, but you'll have to take my archaeological methods class to get all that. So I'll leave it at that.
We do have one more question from the audience.
Hello, my name is Grace Williams. Thank you for coming this presentation. I would like to just address concerns of what if someone discovers some fossils or arrowheads on their land, and they're afraid that the government is going to come in, and then they're like, oh, we're going to mess around with your land right now, and they're like, well, forget that. I'm never going to tell you about this ever. I'm going to sell it on the market because that way no one's going to come to my land right now. So I just wanted to address those concerns.
Sure. Well, let me try to relieve your fears. As I said earlier, we have private property laws in this country, and if you own if you have an archaeological site on your property, right? Nobody's going to swoop in. The state's not going to swoop in and confiscate your property or your artifacts, right? There's no law that is going to allow that. Now, I will say the caveat here has to do with burials, right? Human burials. There is the human burial law, and you just want to be careful about digging up sort of graves, particularly if they're Native American graves. There may be some issues there, but there's this urban mythology here that exists, that the premise of your question is, and there's so much misinformation out there that deals with this, and so I don't know how to state it any more plainly than if you have an archaeological site on your property, it's not going to be confiscated. The only time that any legislation kicks in is that in the instance of state or federal monies that are if there's a federal highway construction, for example, right? Fortunately there are laws that in those cases there's the land is purchased under eminent domain or whatever, and then if that construction does impact an archaeological site, then there's our antiquities laws that kick in that help salvage information from that site sort of prior to construction. But now you can't go on public lands and collect artifacts, which is as it should be. You can't go onto state or forested lands and go up digging. That is a violation of law, and you will get thrown in jail for doing that if you're caught. So we have this public-private distinction here with respect to that. Does that? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yes,
that-
sir. So we have another question.
Hey, Dr. Daniel, this is Noah. So I know with avocational archaeologists or amateurs, they tend to be kind of drawn towards like more recognizable artifacts or things that, for lack of a better way to say it, are flashy, like projectile points. As archaeologists start to work more with amateurs, is there like any attempts to really educate them on other important things that might be less recognizable, like flaking from the manufacturer of the projectile points?
Yeah, sure. I'll say some collectors do collect more than just the recognizable. Points are collected because they're intuitively obvious, right? You don't need to be an archaeologist to recognize those artifacts that I showed pictures of. You don't need to be an archaeologist to recognize, well, there's something distinctive about that, right? And so, as you say, there's other, flaking debris, little chips are not as easily recognized and often not collected, but sometimes they are. Some collectors can recognize that, and to their credit, collected if they keep them, marked and cataloged in a way that's useful. So all I would say along that is that if you're collecting, that it's your responsibility to catalog and keep that material cataloged and recorded in a way that it can be used in the future. I mean, otherwise, why bother? Why collect it if it's not going to be recorded? If you're just going to put it on your mantle, okay, right, I get it, but that's not being kind of a good steward, and that's just my point, right? No pun intended, right? I want to encourage people to do the right thing with response to collecting. Otherwise, just kind of leave it where it is. Somebody may come along, some archaeologist may come along someday and actually record it, right? One thing collectors don't realize, they're sampling the landscape, right? They're sampling the landscape all over North Carolina. They're out there, and if we can get a good enough representation of all these samples across the landscape, that's telling us something important, right? And so that's kind of the virtue of working with collectors in sort of a big picture way.
Okay,
I-
we have
with that-
one. Well, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to hope I answered the question. No,
Yes, sir, you did. We have one, I have not forgotten our online guest, but we have one more in-person question.
Thank you. For those of us who want to do the good thing and have been collecting since we were young, and I'm talking like mid to late 1970s, how do we identify what we've got and how do we identify where to send that?
how do you identify what you got? Well, I'd start with my book, right? You can, my book is a pretty good. And by the way, my book, all those photographs I showed you, those color photo, the picture, the plates in my book are black and white, but there's a link to the color high resolution photographs in the book that you can go to see those, and you can enlarge them and so forth. So, but those are just points. You know, there's pottery. There's a variety of publications that have pottery. And what, I'm sorry, I forget what's the other part of the question?
That was just knowing what we've got and what to do with it.
Just knowing what we have and what to do with them.
Right. Well, knowing what you have, that's, looking in those publications are a good start. And then what you do with them, well, again, that's kind of up to you. But yeah, I would, again, at the risk of repeating myself, I'd start by sorting those by where you found them, right? And keeping a catalog and even putting little numbers on them and keeping them cataloged in a way that somebody could come in and if you got a map with a simple map on it, with a dot on it, that's kind of the basics of the beginning of being sort of responsible with your material, and ultimately then reaching out to maybe some institution to see about recording this.
So I'm going to go to our chat to see what we have in there. Let's see. An educational site that defines point shape types here in the Midwest. Oh no, is cartofacts.us. I would like to share this and hope such a web page can be generated for all of our regions. And we can see a photo of that being held up right now by Mr. Conley. Cartofacts.us has data on radiocarbon dating with the dips in the data, etc. Having is a clue to the use of the point. So I think that is, are there any other comments from our online guests today?
I also would like to point out a shortcoming that is in this link that I just stated and would help in your description, and that is talking about hafting. It seems that that's one thing that's missed, because in the Midwest, a lot of people call something called bird points when in fact they are the arrow points because of the size of the hafting, how big the shaft is, whether it's a handle or a spear point. So a lot of things people call arrowheads probably were on the end of the spear and not an arrow point. So that's something that really isn't really covered, but would help people understand something about points.
Okay, so I do have a question. Does MOA or ECU accept collections?
Well, I'll just speak for ECU. We do accept some collections. The problem is we've got limited space. We need a bigger facility, but we do accept some collections. They have to be pretty well provenienced, along the lines that I've talked about, right? And usually we just focus on sort of Eastern North Carolina more than other parts of the state, right? But so we can, it just depends, right, on those parameters.
So I'm going to let Wanda Laster speak for the Museum of the Albemarle. So Wanda, if you would like to unmute and speak for the museum.
Right. A museum cannot accept any artifacts recovered archaeologically. It all has to go through the Office of State Archaeology. And they are within the same department we are, Department of Natural and Cultural Resources.
Okay, thank you, Wanda. And I just think our last chat, I'm sorry to be clicking on all of these buttons. Sorry about that. But I think our last chat was just a thank you, Dr. Daniel, useful, well done presentation. So that was our last comment. Again, we would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope that we have one more talk this month. We'll have Paul Vincent, who is an employee here at the museum. He's wrote a book on maritime Elizabeth City. So his lecture will be this month also for the month of July. Again, thank you, Dr. Daniel. I know you have a busy schedule and we appreciate you taking the time for us today.
All right. Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. I thank everybody who attended. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.